Good evening. I'd like to welcome our audience here tonight in Enniscorthy and Wexford and out on World Wide Web. I'm Michael Dwyer and I'm here with Family Life, and we're going to be having a chat tonight with well-known author, thinker and provocateur John Waters.
Hello, Michael.
How's the provoking going, John?
Provocatively well, I think. Yeah, it's stirring well. From time to time.
Time to time, okay. You're involved in a European-wide group at the moment called One of Us.
That's right, yeah.
You've been at a couple of meetings. Just give us a bit of background of what they are, what they do.
People may have passed on the radar there back about 5-6 years ago when there was a survey going around of people in Europe asking them to sign a petition. And the objective of that was to get 1 million signatures. And the deal was that the European Commission would recognise anything with 1 million signatures. They got 2 million signatures and the European Commission refused to recognise the achievement. So that battle is ongoing. But nevertheless, the movement has been established, and it's an attempt for the first time to create a Europe-wide pro-life movement, to unite all the pro-life. It's a kind of a movement of pro-life movements in the world, in Europe. And it's broader than the abortion question. It's got a whole range, and all of these kind of bioethical issues are part of it now. But that's down the road a little bit, I think. The initial objective is to create a kind of a platform for people in different professions, thinkers, talkers who are lawyers, doctors, philosophers, academics, etc., who might bring something new to the public discussion about this question. Because I think there's a feeling that on a Europe-wide basis this has been missing, and that the other side has basically run away with the discussion.
Sorry, just before you go on there, you say Europe-wide. Are you talking continental, or are you EU basis? Or? It's
EU basis pretty much, I think, which is, because in fact some of the most active groups within the One of Us seem to be the Eastern European blocs. I mean, certainly they're the most interesting contributors I've heard so far. We were in Brussels a couple of weeks ago, and there were several speakers, all from Eastern European countries, very interesting, and one person who wasn't, and that was Mr. Van Rompuy, and he didn't really mention the question of abortion at all in his speech.
Van Rompuy?
Yes, he was the guest speaker, or the keynote speaker, and which was an odd choice, I thought, but nevertheless, it was a very interesting day. So, and I think this is very interesting and very important, because one of the things that has struck me, certainly you'll have seen this in Ireland. Yeah. If you note the way that in Ireland, this has been kind of hived off as a kind of a theological issue in media discussions and in the public mind to a large degree, as if, that it was theology and nothing else. Well, like in a certain sense, Michael, everything is theology. Okay. Free speech. There's a theological position on free speech. We're in a hotel. There is a theological position on hospitality. There's a theological position on abortion, but that's not the whole of it. That's part, and it feeds into broader questions, or lesser questions, or mixed questions to do with, medical, legal, and other issues, which, we do touch on, obviously, in our discussions. And yet, at the end of the day, it seems that this is the trump card of the other side. And
but I think that if we are complicit with this attempt to make this a purely theological or religious issue, and recognizing that we live in a culture where religion is increasingly perceived to be a private practice,
yes,
rather than a public engagement,
yes,
then you privatize the morality of abortion, and it becomes, well, not for me, but for you, it's not for me to say. We've gone from that Kantian position where if I couldn't recommend something for myself, I couldn't recommend it for others, to the position today where, well, I can't recommend it for me, but it's not my business to impose my private morality on you. So we need to take it out of that private sector and return it to a wider public morality.
Yeah, because actually when you think about that, it's a completely kind of bankrupt position, in my view, that I can support something for you, but not support it in principle. necessarily. It seems to me to be a very evasive position to take on anything. But those kind of tricks have been part of the whole game that has been played in achieving what has been achieved, if that's what it can be called. And I think that it's important, at this moment in Ireland, it would be easy to be despondent and to feel that, well, what's the next stage? I mean, we're on the back foot now, to say the least of it. In a certain sense, you might say the battle is over and it has been lost. But I don't believe that can be the case for a number of reasons. And mainly they're to do with the nature of the debate that has been taking place and the necessity, I think, to change the terms of those debates in the future, albeit that it's late in the day. But nevertheless, I think that we need to actually look at how what was done in terms of the saturation propaganda that was used, the tactics that were used, the foreign money that was used, all of these kind of weapons that were used, which have distorted the question and had the effect that you've just mentioned on certain people, of them being unable to get their heads around those confusing kind of curved balls that are thrown into the debate.
I think one of the most interesting statistics now, we will put as much or as little weight on this as we like, but in the polling that was done in the aftermath, the exit polling and the aftermath of the referendum, the poll suggested that of those who changed their mind during the campaign, 80% changed their mind from no to yes.
Yes.
From anti-repeal to repeal.
Yes.
Now, in the same piece of analysis, we discovered that in different newspapers, the news reports, not the opinion pieces, but the news reports, were 95% of the stories were abortion positive.
Yes.
5% life positive. And that was the newspapers, and not a dissimilar story in the TV, in the radio. It's hardly surprising.
No, it's not surprising at all.
So I think that it would be a mistake to look at the magnitude of the results and to assume that somehow that is written in stone, that doesn't come from the result of a well-played political game and a long-played political game, but not one that's invincible.
That's exactly right, Michael. I mean, that we should not come to see this as some kind of naturalistic evolution of the public mind, because it is an evolution that has occurred under severe pressure and distortion, and I would say indeed corrupt communications. And so we need to become more and more conscious of being able to describe to people what's actually happening in front of their noses, so that they can see the effects of it, on themselves as much as on other people. I think that's probably the biggest factor that we had to face in this discussion, because, in terms of ground troops, in terms of I'm talking about the referendum campaign last year, in terms of arguments, in terms of all the extraneous kind of elements that you might say on the surface, on the field of battle, you couldn't call it. And yet, there was this extraordinary phenomenon happening underneath, which comes from the idea that we all, whether we're aware of it or not, want to be with the group.
Yeah.
We want to be approved of. We don't want to be disapproved of. We certainly don't want to be loathed and detested, which you can be on these questions. And so when you find that everybody, and I don't mean just on the TV, but your neighbours, as a result of watching the TV, are all increasingly of the same mind, gradually people, even people who are very well intentioned and start out being quite clear-sighted about these questions, they end up wavering or worse. And that's kind of what happened. So, the problem is with all of this that there was no super seeing instrument that would have been able to describe this. We describe it, but we would, wouldn't we?
We would, wouldn't we? Yeah. But going back to this, the one of us, is there an emerging strategy of how to approach the issue in a pan-European way? What's your sense?
It's early days. I mean, I've only been to 2 meetings, and I think that's pretty much all that's really happened in the last, apart from their initial push a few years ago to get the signatures. But there's a big emphasis on creating a platform across Europe of people who would become more and more visible, speaking about these issues in an authoritative way, not necessarily from a clerical position, shall we say.
Sure.
And that's been missing. And I think to actually unite the groups across Europe also and give them common purpose and a sense of the possibility of pooling their energies and bringing each other's countries and comparing notes about what's actually happened there and what's going to happen there. I think one of the great resources in Europe on this question is the fact that Eastern Europe is still strong.
Mm-hmm. And unapologetic.
Yes, unapologetic. And they're amazingly clear-sighted and highly intelligent about what they say. I listen to 5 speakers now, one from Croatia, one from Estonia, Russia, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia. Absolutely brilliant speakers. Very clear about it. This sounds a little bit naive, but sometimes I find myself in all of these discussions standing back and remembering, when I was a teenager, listening to debates about, human rights and all the rest of it, and thinking, like, wasn't it possible at the beginning that all of that energy that ended up on the left ended up under the influence of feminism? All that kind of positive energy for human rights could have ended up on the side of the baby in the womb. It's not impossible. It's something, it's almost like a quirk of ideology in history that it didn't, because there is actually no more vulnerable and no more precious and fragile and voiceless entity on the planet than the child in the womb. And yet it is possible for adults to sit in studios behind microphones and actually talk down the most fundamental rights of this category of human person. And we need, I think, to actually start together across Europe to create a new chorus for Europe, to alert Europe to the fact that this is not over, that Eastern Europe has not fallen, and it can lead us back from the abyss. Because the abyss is waiting for us, Michael. I don't know if people are aware, because again, the word corruption is opposite. But I suspect that people in Ireland are not aware that in January, the state of New York voted to make abortion legal up to 9 months, and that is where we eventually will end up if we don't stop this.
I read about it at the time. I'm not crystal clear, but it wasn't simply that they decriminalised it up to that, but rather it was enshrined somehow into the state constitution.
Yes, you see, the objective of these people for a long time, and this is really interesting and quite tragic from our point of view. The push in recent times, very quietly at first, but with increasing vigour, is to make abortion a human right. Now, it hasn't been up to now. But so that not only do they take the human rights from the child, but they make abortion, the killing of the child, a human right. Now, I would argue, and I did argue in the course of the campaign last year, that we were already doing that with the amendment we brought in, because we brought it into Article 40, which is a fundamental rights article. And when you actually put something into a fundamental rights article, you are making it a fundamental right, by definition. Now, you might say, well, okay, in the court next week, if there's a case, well, it's very unlikely that a judge or judges might come to that conclusion, because they would have some memory of the mechanism by which this ended up in the Constitution. But give it 10 or 15 years, when that context is no longer present, when memories have faded, and people are not maybe disposed to look back at the newspaper archives or to see what actually was said and why.
On the judiciary of the day.
Exactly right. Then you say, they'll say, at the top it says fundamental right, and here it says, termination of pregnancy. That is a fundamental human right.
This is going on certainly 30 years anyway, at the level of the United Nations.
Yes. Various
conferences going. I remember there was a conference in Egypt back in the early 90s where it was going to be enshrined as a right, except there was a rather strange piece of diplomacy between the Arab nations, the Vatican and others to get it voted down. But this has always, I think,
yes, and
long term.
It has been somewhat sotto voce up to now in general in the public discourse, because it would be such a repugnant idea for most people, particularly say in places like Ireland. But now you would actually have to say that after the victory, as it were, of last year, can it be said any longer that such an idea would be repugnant? I'm not so sure you can. And when you have a few more hard cases to be put before the people, that wears down whatever resolve is left. And in the end, but I don't actually think that they need to do anything further, really, except wait for the article as it now stands to come to fruit, and it will actually deliver them what they want, unless we roll back.
I mean, it's curious that in the Dáil we've already heard some of those the more extreme voices on the left speaking about it as if it was enshrined explicitly in the Constitution.
Yes.
It's right.
Yes.
And complaining when people were trying to pass fairly basic level piece of amendment to the legislation, that they were somehow frustrating what was now a constitutional right.
Well, that's very interesting, because you know that there was that episode, that kind of act of misdirection, that sleight of hand that the government played by drawing the public's attention to the wording of the statute that they were putting before, which is a loose statute which was being advanced.
Yes.
This is what we're going to introduce. Of course, that had no meaning whatsoever. What had meaning was the destruction of the protection that was in the Constitution and what was happening over there. But they were constantly drawing, and the media were constantly drawing the public's attention to what was happening here, which was relatively irrelevant in the medium to longer term, because it can be ridden by another government in the morning, or the same government in the morning, if it chooses to override it. And so it was quite irrelevant. And yet that was a lot of the discussion in the debate, so-called, was about what was actually in the package that was to be implemented in law, the piece of legislation, after the amendment was passed.
There is a sense, and I say this carefully, Sean, that in the short term, abortion has ceased to be a hot button political issue in Ireland. That right now we are, in a sense, on our hunkers, we're sitting back, we're looking at where we go next. There are other issues that have now become more front and centre. Well, at least I believe that there are certain things that they're going to come for.
Yes.
Where do you think where is the barrel pointing now?
You mean in terms of the
agenda of the progressive agenda?
Well, I mean, obviously the whole LGBT trans and thing is still bubbling away there, and they're going to push that. Bringing that into schools is very important. But I think also the most worrying thing is on the demographic. There's a connection between that and the migration, the mass migration issue, and the demographic shifts that are happening, because they really do threaten the nature of this country even in the medium term. And I don't think there's no discussion about this other than calling racist anybody who dares to mention it. But it's a very important issue, and it's related to the abortion issue very clearly in this sense. Our fertility rate right now is 1.8. That compares to 2.1 would be replacement.
Yeah.
And 1.8 is actually a not unhealthy level, in the sense that statistically, because there's a kind of you can actually increase your population rapidly over 2 or 3 generations, or decrease it just as rapidly over 2 or 3 generations, with a very small percentage of difference.
Yeah.
So, as I understand it, the critical level is 1.6. That once you hit 1.6 and go under 1.6, you go to nothing over 2 generations.
Right.
Virtually nothing. I mean, whereas with 1.8 you can sustain maybe 80% of your population over the next 50 years.
Now, historically, we had already had a pretty high rate.
We had, yeah. But it's now dimensioned. But that was before we introduced abortion into our own country. And I think if anything is calculated to bring our fertility rate from 1.8 to 1.6 than it is abortion, almost certainly within 10 to 15 years, we will be at that dangerous 1.6 level, which means that over the next 50 years, the Irish population, seen as a block, shall we say, no, this isn't that simple, of course, it's not.
No.
But in crude terms, would go to something like 25% of its present level over the next 30, 40 years. It's that kind of figure that we're looking at, that particularly with an aging population and people increasingly the greater bulk of our population being older. So I think these are the questions which we ought to be, if we had a proper discussion capacity in our culture, media culture, we will be talking about these things, and we will be talking about them freely.
Just, there's one issue there which I think that we should advert to as well, because to my knowledge there are at least 2 private bills in preparation, and I think we'll probably see the politics of it will be that one of them will be adopted by the government, which is for euthanasia.
Yes.
And I think a lot of us expected that once the amendment was over with and done, then the next thing would be
a
euthanasia.
Yes. Well, it will be. I hate to say that, but I think that will be relatively easy after what we've come through for them to do, because it can be couched in terms of the need of the vulnerable person, and it doesn't affect anybody else in the first instance, and it won't in the first instance. But once you create a culture and a context for this to happen, then it will very quickly move from voluntary to quasi-mandatory, because there will be all kinds of cultural pressures. Older people, the cost of medical care, the burden on families, particularly in a culture where young people can't any longer afford to buy houses. It's a very interesting thing. These people, older people, have houses. How come? Why have you not lived long enough? I'm serious. This is the kind of discussion which is already being prepared. And if you think that
it'll be couched in the language of compassion.
Compassion, yes, and tolerance, and equality, and the right to choose. Mm-hmm. The right to choose, and then there's all kinds of grey areas, like when somebody becomes mentally, unfit. Well, where does choice come into it? Well, how do they decide that? Who decides that?
I mean, you've got to the point now where in Belgium, young people suffering from mental illness, for example, suffering from severe chronic depressive illness, are opting for euthanasia. Yes. When there are therapeutic options, and when in the medium term there is a very real chance that these people could see a dramatic improvement in their lives. We're increasingly, I hear these little bells of the economic language starting to come in.
Well, when you don't have any other kind of language to define human, aspiration, then you are defined purely in terms of your economic capacity. I mean, I talked about in my book the two rooms that we can now see already in Irish society, which should really fill us with dread. And one is the room in the creche where the little babies are left sitting there at 7:30 in the morning, and left for 12 hours sitting on mats or sleeping on mats covered with rugs, looked after by strangers while their parents go out to work to try to put a roof over their heads. That's one room. The other room is what happens at the other end of the cycle, at the other end of your span of 70, 70 years and 10, where you are taken off to the nursing home, and you go. Anybody who's ever been in one of those, I think will have had a sobering kind of experience. Where people are sitting around the walls. The television set is blaring in the corner. There's nobody speaking. They're probably drugged up to their eyeballs, frankly, I mean, anytime I've ever had to go there, and I've been there quite a number of times visiting various people, I have to take to the bed for 24 hours myself to absorb it and to come to terms with the grief that I feel out of that. Now, but there's a solution. There's a solution.
Do tell.
Because, we have already worked on the abortion question, which will reduce the numbers of babies in the creche. And we'll be reducing the numbers of older people sitting around the walls of these rooms in this other way.
Relieving them from their pain, and taking pressure off an already pressurized health system.
Celebrating the lives that they have lived.
Giving them the choice to end their lives with dignity.
Anybody who at this stage has come through what we've come through and think that we're exaggerating needs to go back and read their newspapers again over the last 5 years and looked at what the things that were foisted and imposed on the Irish people, apparently against their will. But now, the things that were unthinkable a decade ago, that are now the law of the land.
I've friends of mine will tell you, for many years ad nauseum, I have enjoyed observing that when a politician comes to you and says to you things like, we must be practical, we must be sensible, we must be pragmatic.
Yes.
Be ready for them to suggest something very wicked indeed.
Indeed.
And when they use those words, they know it's wicked, but they have to get you ready just in case.
Yes, I think, Michael, what is important is useful lives. I think that would be a more...
I'm laughing, but it's gruesome. And we've been here before.
Yes.
That's the thing. We have been here before. We have learned nothing from history.
Nothing. We don't learn.
Okay, but let's not give in to the temptation of despair.
No.
Let's talk practical politics.
Yes.
I'm hearing around the country that people are meeting, more and more people are saying they're fed up. They're going the old what we call the heritage parties have lost that
Yes.
chain, that ball and chain on attachment to the vote. The traditional loyalties are dissolving. That people are looking around. Do you have any sense that and what would you say to people out there? I mean, if people out there saying, "Will I get engaged? What should I do?"
Okay.
Just practically speaking.
Well, I have mixed feelings about it. I mean, I would love to, sit here and give you my wishful thinking. I mean,
Yeah.
because there are some positive signs for certain. I just don't know how powerful they are in their capacity to overcome the inertia of the Irish system, which is deeply cultural, enculturated over decades and decades. But one never knows. I think it'll take some kind of a crisis. The strange thing is, you were saying about the pro-life issue. People disagree with me about this, but I have always felt that issue has no electoral traction in a parliamentary or in a conventional election.
Yeah.
In a referendum, it is itself, but it doesn't translate very well because, and it goes back to the point we were making earlier, that it is seen as a theological issue. It's not a philosophical issue rooted in a set of ideas which are to do with life.
It doesn't impact immediately and directly on your life.
Yes.
Except in in small circumstances.
Yeah, but it's interesting if you look at something like the League, Lega in Italy.
Yeah.
They have brought together pro-life and demography in a very good way. And they've actually started to talk about incentivizing families to have more children.
But Douglas Murray asks this question. I don't want to get too deep into this area, but Murray, The Strange Death of Europe, he says sometime in the 50s and 60s, different countries across Europe were faced with the reality that they were no longer reproducing at replacement levels. And this was causing an economic problem. And that for them was the big issue. It's an economic problem. What should we do? I said, rather than say, why are we not doing this anymore? Something we have done for the last 5,000 years, 10,000 years, we have reproduced. This generation has stopped doing that. Rather than ask the question, what policies can we study that will bring us back to the normal state?
Well, that's the
they
thing.
just said, well, we just import people. And I think if we look at, say, the housing policy in this country, which is forcing young people either to give up on the idea of ever having a house or to postpone forming families, to postpone having children, these are policies which are deliberately driving people in a direction which is anti-family.
And there are profound connections between all of these questions. I mean, and the pro-life question per se, I mean, fits right in there. The problem with it is that it is the pro-life question, which has somehow been separated out and hived off as this kind of quasi-theological and a separate issue. And it's sort of a Catholic thing. But it's not. I mean, it is and it isn't. It is a Catholic thing, of course, but it's also a human thing. It is also a political thing. It is right in there. And there's a very interesting, hopeful thing that I picked up in recent times. There's a man called Dr. Stephen Turley, who's online, and Turley Talks. A very interesting guy. He does 2 talks a day, relatively short, between 7 and 20 minutes. And he has a whole thing like that. There is a very interesting phenomenon which has not been picked up in America particularly, but also he thinks in Europe, whereby that it is actually left liberal families who are not having children.
Yes.
That fundamentally religious conservative families are having children again after quite a long, like in America particularly, evangelical Christians in America, for example. And what's actually happening is the old traditional Protestant churches in America people are beginning to join the evangelicals. And they're having bigger families.
Well, religiously, I think in the States, people are either going one way or the other. They're either going to Rome, or Orthodoxy, or they're going to the evangelicals. What was considered mainstream Protestantism in the middle seems to be dying.
So yes, that's right. And so the potential for that is that kind of downward, upward spiral those spirals that we talked about can actually come to bear on this question in a very particular way. That over 2 generations, if conservative Christian religious families were capable of transmitting their own belief systems to their children successfully, then you would actually have a total reversal of all of this. Now, where I don't have a theory as yet is how this matches into Ireland, because we're actually at the point where we're still rejecting religion. we haven't actually begun to understand what the rest of us understand. 4 out of 5 people in the world belong to one of the main religions. This is extraordinary. We're told that religion is over. 4 out of 5 people in the world belong to one of the half dozen main churches in the world.
Sure.
Now, but we seem to think that Ireland, we've left all that behind.
Oh, well, in the language, shall we, of the left, this is a very Eurocentric, a very ethnocentric way of looking at the world.
Yes.
Religion is doing very well, thank you, most of the rest of the world, just not doing that well here. We have also, frankly, even from the non-believer's perspective, kind of an immature form of disbelief.
We do.
It's a bit of a boo sucks to you kind of thing.
It is exactly that, yeah.
John, just before we finish up, Adrian has sent me a couple of questions here from the one, but one of Anne in Meath wants to know, she points out that we have elections coming up at the end of May, local elections and Europeans. Do you see any hope there of somebody, maybe the beginning of a disruption? The beginning, at least.
Again, I'm not certain about Ireland, but I do feel that Europe is going to turn very dramatically in the European elections in May. I think that already the signs are there right across Europe, in Germany, in France, in Spain, in Sweden, and the Netherlands last week. There are signs of what would be called a rightward shift. I don't particularly like that kind of terminology. I just don't see. Ireland is so stitched up by our media that it's actually impossible for anything to breathe.
Yeah, but I don't know if that's true at the local level. I think that if you have somebody at the local level who's willing to go out, knock on the doors, talk to the people.
Yes.
And also, local media tends to be far less compromised than national media. You're going to get a better run out of your local radio, Southeast Radio, the People papers,
those parts of it that are not controlled by the national media and significant.
But at the end of the day, they're about making money, and it's possible to get at them. I mean, it's possible to.
Well, I certainly think that if people, the knocking on doors is the most powerful way, and that works nowhere as well as it works in a local election.
Yeah.
So actually going up and having conversations with people on their own doorsteps, because one of the things I have found in recent times is that there's an extraordinary phenomenon where people are carrying around these questions and thoughts, and they think they're unique to them. They think that they uniquely are worried, concerned, anxious about all this stuff. And then they actually they meet somebody, or they're in a room and somebody says something, and they go away intoxicated because they think other people think the same things.
Right.
And this is what I mean about the country being stitched up. Its thought process is stitched up. But the great thing is that when you go to somebody, when a canvasser goes to somebody and knocks on their door, there's a good chance they're going to be open. And if you just say the right thing, you could find the floodgates opening. Yeah. And that's what I think. I do think that, it's not that we're not going to see it. We do see it. We do know the truth deep down in our hearts in Ireland, as people in Europe and America do as well. The thing is that the question is, can we get it from the heart to the head and out the mouth is the problem.
Yeah.
And particularly in this stitched up situation that we have in our media terms.
I'll meld the last one question. There are two questions here from the room, and I'll meld them into one. We have a couple of candidates here in the room tonight running for Renewa for Wexford, and then others from Carlow and Kilkenny from the area. If they were going to take you on as a highly paid political consultant, media manager, guru, what message would you say to them that they should be bringing to the door? Would you encourage them, or would you say that?
Oh no, I would encourage them, because I admire Renewa tremendously. I mean, Renewa was the only political party really that was out there in the referendum, and speaking the truth. And it's a unique party, a unique movement in Ireland, and hopefully growing. I spoke at their conference a couple of years ago, and I said to them that they needed to dig deeper. And by that I meant that they need to bring to kind of create more unified themes, to bring together some of the things we're talking about here, whether it's mass migration, demography, abortion. Those three are connected. There's a pattern in all of this. The effect of the policies, just as there is an agenda behind that unites those issues on the part of the other side, there is an agenda, or should be, or ought to be, an agenda on our side to bring them together also, to allow people to see what actually is at stake fundamentally in terms of the nature of our country. Not just in terms, and not just, I don't mean just in terms of the makeup of it, the demographic of it, which is important, I think, culturally and otherwise, but in terms of what the quality of its life shall be. Because I firmly believe, when I said this, that once you introduce the killing of a human person under any heading into a culture and make it legal and put it in its constitution, you're on a very slippery slope indeed, because I don't think you can know where to stop. You know, I've asked that of lawyers, and I've asked them why they would not go to the Supreme Court and force the Supreme Court to actually state clearly on what basis the life of a child might be taken, so that we could see what they had said, and in words that were actually, you know, matched the deed that was being done. Because we do need to, we can't, this is, you know, the fudging has been the way that they've done it. You know, it's a private matter. That's how they did it with Roe versus Wade. And that's underneath all of this kind of stuff. We make the child invisible. We don't talk about the child as a child. The child is a non-person metaphorically, and by being a non-person metaphorically, becomes a non-person literally. And that's where we have to start thinking about this, that it's not some kind of cul-de-sac of residual Catholicism. This is core to our civilization. It's core to our humanity. It's core to our country and our society and the way it thinks and the way it acts. And what we are not wrong. We are not some residue of some ancient, you know, wrong-headedness.
Yes.
We are actually right. We are actually right. This is the only position for any sentient human person to take, and that is on the side of the child in the womb. If you're not on the side of the child in the womb, then to hell with you, as far as I'm concerned. You're on the side of nothing right. You cannot be.
Well, John, on that note, I think I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank the audience here for being so attentive and so quiet. I'd like to thank our viewers out there in the World Wide Web. And I'd say I enormously, as always, have enjoyed and found it enlightening to talk to John. And I'd like to say everybody out there to get involved, stay involved, and join the resistance. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.